This is Pro Football Perspective. I am Nathaniel Bradley. Whether you're at home, work, the gym, in your car, or wherever you are, thanks for taking time out of your day to spend here. Pro Football Perspective is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and YouTube. And of course, be sure to follow on Instagram at Pro Football Perspective. What's happening? I am back after a household bout with COVID, but alas, the enemy has been vanquished, and now in Pro Football Perspective's return, we are going to move forward into our next GOAT quarterback metric with a rapid-fire episode jam-packed with insights on the special team support of our GOAT group. You know, we often hear the coach speak in press conferences where they say they want their team to dominate in all three phases of the game. And we hear announcers sometimes chime in that special teams is 1/3 of the game. Well, those are a bit cliche, and the measurables don't really support those statements. But I will say this, you know, you can win without dominant special teams, and special teams don't necessarily account for 1/3 of the game. But it is true that winning a championship with atrocious special teams play is incredibly rare. So, you know, maybe you don't need the dominant unit, but you don't want to have an awful unit either. And while special teams don't necessarily account for 1/3 of the game, it is true that special teams plays are high leverage plays, and they offer a disproportional impact on the outcome of the game compared to the average defensive or offensive snap. So that much is true. So much like the previous metric when the defensive support of each of these GOAT quarterbacks was measured and ranked accordingly, so too shall the special team support be measured. How, you might ask? Well, I'm happy to explain. There are a variety of special teams categories to look at out there. And when I say variety, I mean too many. Some of the more common categories that you might think of off the top of your head or you think would be useful in terms of evaluating special teams play would be field goal percentage, extra point percentage, yards per punt return, yards per kickoff return. And the defensive equivalent of each of these, you know, field goal percentage against, extra point percentage against, yards per punt against, et cetera, et cetera. There's also a statistic out there that measures the average starting field position, both for a given team and against said given team. I really like that statistic, but unfortunately it just isn't available for a large number of the players within the GOAT group just because of when they played. And so I chose to utilize other statistics instead of that. Going forward, though, I would recommend that's something that you would look at to determine kind of a field position category in terms of special team support, because it is readily available for all current quarterbacks and going forward as well. So there are a bunch of combinations and variations within each of these stats that you could use to evaluate special teams as a whole. And initially, that's kind of what I was going to do. But what I discovered is that some of these categories produce painfully small variations from one season to another, from one team to another. And so making these things kind of close to useless when it comes to arriving at any kind of conclusion to determine a superior or inferior performance from a unit. So here are the categories I chose to ignore in this evaluation. I'm not using them, and for good reason. Extra point percentage, both for and allowed. There just wasn't much variation outside of the first decade or so of the league when it was extremely up and down per team and per season. Ultimately, it's just not a very useful stat to really indicate, you know, a good special teams unit or not. It's just all over the map. There's no consistency there at the beginning of the league's inception, and then currently there's just not enough variation, you know, from one team to another or one season to another to really say, oh, this team's awesome in extra points or this team's terrible in extra points. It's just not there. So I did not use that statistic at all. The next category I kind of, again, removed and did not utilize, yards per punt, both for and against. Also, they just didn't generate much deviation up or down from any kind of average. Also, because punts are typically measured by length, either on its own or a net, it doesn't really account for a good punt team as much as it's just accounting for the longest punt team, if that makes sense. For example, if a coach decides to punt from their opponent's 47-yard line, you're not going to get a great yardage figure either on its own or the net yardage, but it could still be a great punt if the execution of it pins the opponents within the 15 or 10-yard line. So, I mean, the more I think about this stat in particular, the more I realize, hey, this can be useful if we take a few extra steps. Maybe we measure the yardage as a ratio compared to where the line of scrimmage is, and the return yardage as a ratio of the total length, because the longer a punt typically is, the longer the return typically is. It just yields a longer return due to coverage team taking longer to get down the field. So in any case, maybe I can revisit this stat in the future and make it more useful, but the raw data available just doesn't give a great picture as to what a good or bad special teams unit is in terms of yards per punt, whether it's for or against. It just doesn't really add up or give a great picture there. The last category I chose not to use was kickoff yardage, both for and against. I think this is just dependent too much on game strategy currently, whether a coach chooses to have a touchback or a mortar kick. Neither one is indicative of that kickoff team being good or bad. It's just strategy. And even before the NFL moved the line of scrimmage forward for kickoffs, these stats were very much like extra point percentage, where there just wasn't a large range of data. Everyone was very tightly packed together, both from one team to another and from one season to another. So not enough variation there to really define any kind of solid opinion on who's good and who's bad there. So that leaves us with the following data points to look at: field goal percentage, both for and against; yards per punt return, both for and against, so just the return; and yards per kick return, both for and against. Again, just the return of the kicks there. Field goal percentage tells you how efficient your special teams are at scoring points when called upon. So it's definitely better than looking at total points. Okay, I'll say that again, better than looking at total points scored by your special teams, because the best field goal unit is the one that rarely has to step on the field, but when they do, they're darn near automatic. So there's a reason why we're looking at field goal percentage and not field goals made or anything like that. That's silly. Yards per punt return and yards per kickoff return combine to give you a good picture of field position. Again, we're not going to be looking at the kickoff yardage or the punt yardage, but just the return yardage, because both the punt and kickoff yardage tend to be pretty darn close to the same for everybody. Not enough variation to really dictate anything significant there. Now, how I chose to look at these was to gauge each category not compared to league average. Okay, so when we looked at defensive support, we were comparing that to league average. There was a reason for that. We're going to compare special teams compared literally against the opponents played on the schedule. We're doing that because it is isolated from quarterback play. Defensive support is different. You're not going to compare your defense to the opposing team's defense if you're trying to figure out who has the better quarterback, because the opposing team's defense is facing your quarterback. Okay, so there's too many variables there and too much influence from the quarterback play. But when it comes to special teams, we can do this and have a really, really good idea of who has the better special team support, because quarterback play is not influencing it here. There's really no factoring into it. So yeah, we're going to be looking at each category, not compared to league average, but compared literally against the opponents of the team. So as always, my methods and grading system, they're on Instagram at Pro Football Perspective. So I do encourage you to visit the page, and you can like, comment, agree, disagree, or just stare at the screen for a while. I don't care. But just know that the scoring methodology is there for reference. Okay, so here's the scoring as follows here. Field goal percentage delta. You're going to divide your team's field goal percentage by your opponents and subtract 1. This gives you how much better or worse the field goal percentage was for your team compared to your opponents. Example here would be 1975 Steelers. They made 81% of their field goals attempted. Their opponents that season made 61.1% of their field goals attempted against the Steelers. Okay, not talking about how they did against the league in general, just against the Steelers. So you take 81 divided by 61.1, subtract 1, and you get 32.5%. This shows that the 1975 Steelers were essentially making 3 field goals for every 2 field goals their opponents made that year. It's an elite score of 32.5%, and that was their field goal percentage delta. The next category in scoring that we're going to look at is yards per punt return delta. Dividing your team's yards per punt return by your opponent's and subtracting 1. And that gives you how much better or worse the punt return team was for your team compared to your opponents that season. Again, using the 75 Steelers as an example, 10.1 yards per punt return. Their opponents that season, 5.5 yards per punt return. So they darn near doubled up their opponents. So you take 10.1 divided by 5.5, subtract 1, and you get 83.64%. This shows that the 75 Steelers punt return team was more than 80% better than their opponents that year, and really accounting for basically 10 yards of net field position per exchange of punts. So a great unit and a great example there of how you can score that and really quantify it. The last category we're using for special team support grading is yards per kick return delta. You get this by dividing your team's yards per kick return by your opponents and subtracting 1. This gives you how much better or worse the kick return team was for your team compared to your opponents. For example, 75 Steelers had 21.4 yards per kick return. Their opponents that season had 20.4 yards per kick return against them. Again, that's how many yards their opponents got per kick return against the Steelers, not for their entire season, just against the Steelers. So you take 21.4 divided by 20.4, subtract 1, and you get 4.9%. Okay, so not as big of a variation there, but still better. So the 75 Steelers kick return team was slightly better than their opponents, and they accounted for a couple of yards of net field position per exchange of kickoffs that season. So there's the 3 categories, and when all 3 of these are averaged, you have a great, but not perfect, idea of how well or poorly special teams were for a given team in a given season, and then you can obviously kind of take the aggregate over a career. The percentage score generated by each calculation is then assigned a grade. Okay, I've got grades, I've got names for the grades. So 17.5% or higher, that's an elite special team score. 12.5% to 17.5%, that's a great special team score. 7.5% to 12.5%, that's a good special team score. 2.5% to 7.5%, that's above average. And then you get the average category is negative 2.5% to 2.5%. That's average. Below average is negative 2.5% to negative 7.5%. Bad would be negative 7.5% to negative 12.5%. And then terrible would be negative 12.5% to negative 17.5%. And then atrocious special teams play would be anything below 17.5%. And again, this is all compared directly to your opponents you're playing against, not to league average. So again, maybe there's some type of coaching strategy or coaching ability that might come into play here. But I like this much better than comparing to league average, because this really brings into play how your special teams played situationally, and how that may or may not have affected the opponents directly within each game and the impact that it has there within. So again, all of these are easily viewable graphics on Instagram at Pro Football Perspective, so you can follow along there. Each category was scored for each qualifying season of the quarterback in the GOAT group. Okay, so again, there are going to be some seasons that are just flat out left out. We're only going to be grading the seasons they played 7 or more games. The quarterback with the best overall special team score over the course of his career was ranked 16th. Okay, and the quarterback with the worst overall special teams grade of over his career was ranked 1st. So this is the same line of thinking that we did with the defensive support grading system. Okay, essentially a player doing more with less is more impressive to me. Okay, I'm going to give credit to a quarterback that essentially overcame special teams play if their special teams play was bad, rather than rewarding a quarterback that had awesome special teams play. Okay, so that's just how we're looking at this. Again, anybody in the top 16 here is I'm calling them the GOAT group. So anybody in the top 16 here of my list, they're pretty darn good in my book. So no disrespect to any of them, really, when you take a look at it. Before I get started, just a refresher to everyone that we are looking at 16 quarterbacks, and I think all 16 of them have some sort of valid claim to being the GOAT. Some more than others, but all of these players are certainly thought of as all-time greats, and they're all icons. We've got Sammy Baugh, Terry Bradshaw, Tom Brady, Drew Brees, John Elway, Brett Favre, Otto Graham, Peyton Manning, Dan Marino, Joe Montana, Aaron Rodgers, Bart Starr, Roger Staubach, Johnny Unitas, Kurt Warner, and Steve Young. Okay. And now let's take a look at how these quarterbacks of the GOAT group stack up in terms of special team support. Who had an advantage throughout their career? Who had to overcome a bit more? Follow along on Instagram at Pro Football Perspective for the visual aid as I go through these. Hang on to your butts. Here we go. Coming in at number 16 is Otto Graham. So much like he had the best defensive support of any of the quarterbacks within the GOAT group, Otto Graham also had the best special team support of anyone in the GOAT group here, coming in at number 16. Throughout his career, if you take the aggregate, he had special team support 17.61% better than opponents. So he just averaged elite special teams play throughout his career. Some truly outlandish numbers when you look at his season-by-season scores or by category. 1953, for example, his field goal percentage delta for the special teams unit was 474%. Yes, 474%. His team, the Browns, were 88.5% in their field goal percentage. Their opponents that season were 15.4%. Just a crazy range of better play. And it was like that, pretty crazy numbers. In 1950, the field goal percentage delta was 83%, still extremely high. 1954, he had a field goal percentage delta of 100%, so they doubled up their opponents that season in terms of field goal percentage. Season by season, 1946, he had a 2.81% overall score. 1947, negative 0.05%. 1948, negative 6%. 1949, negative 20%. Outside of that, I mean, they're all pretty good scores. You're looking at 70% in 1950, 15% in 1951, 9% in 52. 1953 overall special teams performed 148% better than their opponents during that season. Basically, this all breaks down to his overall special team support being awesome, elite, year in and year out. He actually did score below average in terms of yards per kick return delta. Throughout his career, his special teams units averaged negative 9% there, so they actually underperformed their opponents, probably because they were kicking the ball off that much more often. But yeah, the special teams that Otto Graham played with was pretty darn impressive, so he came in at number 16. Next up at number 15 in terms of special team support among the GOAT group, we have Tom Brady. So Tom Brady didn't have nearly the special team support that Otto Graham had, but nobody did. Brady still had excellent special teams throughout his career, or continues to have excellent special teams throughout his career. During his qualifying season, so again, eliminating the 2008 season and the 2000 season where he didn't start any games, really Brady's had... the Patriots are one category and Tampa Bay is another category, really. So altogether of the 20 qualifying seasons, I mean, Brady has had just 5 seasons where he's had below average special teams play overall. The rest have been above average or better. He's had 2 above average seasons of special teams play. He's had 2 good seasons of special teams play. And then he's had 3 great seasons of special teams play and 8 separate seasons of elite special teams play from his special teams units. So great support, and it's pretty well rounded as well. His worst category is yards per kick return delta, where he's almost dead average for his career, his special teams units. Yards per punt return delta, on the other hand, for his career, he's averaging 19.24%. So really performing well. He's had some pretty astronomical numbers here and there. A couple of down years in 2004 and 2005 in that category, and then most recently with Tampa Bay the last 2 seasons. I mentioned that it's almost like there's 2 separate categories here. There's New England and then there's Tampa Bay. The past 2 seasons with Tampa Bay, Tom Brady's had overall special team support of negative 22.03%. That's atrocious. And negative 0.05 or negative 15% special team support, and that's terrible. Those are his 2 worst special teams units of his career by a lot. You have to go all the way back to 2004 to have a special teams unit even close to that, and that was a negative 12.7%. Also terrible, but considerably different than those 2 scores. When you look across his field goal percentage delta category throughout his career, also he scores good there, 9% better than his opponents throughout his career there. His best outing would have been the 2002 season when the Patriots were 53% better than their opponents in terms of field goal percentage score there. The worst outing was actually his final season in New England at 11% below average there. So when you boil it down, though, modern day quarterbacks, he's had the best special teams play of anybody in the GOAT group. So great play there. Probably goes a little bit to the coaching, but still hell of a support for him, and obvious why he's got plenty of hardware to go along with that when you factor in the defensive play and special teams play. On to number 14 in terms of special teams support, Terry Bradshaw. So Bradshaw, playing with the Steelers throughout the 70s, had special teams that really was kind of up and down. Unlike his defensive support, which was consistently, just slobber knockers year in and year out, the special teams support went up and down, 6% below average in 1970, then just barely above average in 71. 72 was elite level, 36% above average. Then you've got 1973 was 3% below. 74 and 75 were identical at 8% above. It was just up and down. What it all boiled down to was 6% better than his opponents throughout his career, 6.51% better than his opponents throughout his career. Best category for Bradshaw's Steelers were yards per punt return delta. They were 15.43% better than their opponents throughout his playing days. His yards per kick return delta, he was just ever so slightly worse than their opponents at negative 0.91%. Field goal percentage delta, they were 5% better than their opponents throughout his career. Extremely solid special teams play. It's not like it was a glaring issue on the team that held them back by any stretch, and obviously came through really well in terms of field position when it comes to the punt return delta score there. And as I said, number 14 for Terry Bradshaw at 6.51% better than his opponents in terms of special teams support. And now number 13 in terms of special teams support among the GOAT group, Sammy Baugh. So Sammy Baugh is an interesting character. Some of these statistics that I looked at flat out were just absent from the records because Sammy Baugh played that long ago. So his first 4 seasons, I had no data to really go off of. It was incomplete at best. But what was surprising is that Sammy Baugh played punter, okay? But his team's overall yards per punt return delta was the worst category. It was 7% worse than their opponents throughout his career. Now, obviously, him being the punter isn't really telling the whole story there, but he is a part of that unit, and I mean, he's an all-time great football player, so that just was surprising overall. Sammy Baugh's best category in terms of special team support was the field goal percentage delta. His teams were averaging across his career 23.8% better than their opponents. Yards per kick return delta, his teams were 2.55% better than their opponents throughout his career, so just slightly above average there. Total for his career, special team support wound up being 6.43% better than their opponents throughout his career. So again, had plenty of support there. It was by no means any kind of thorn in the side of Sammy Baugh. The special teams play on his teams was just fine and enabled for plenty of wins there. But yeah, super surprising that the punt return delta was actually below average. If we can get our hands on more data, maybe we can take a deeper dive into that and see what's going on there. But Sammy Baugh coming in at number 13 in terms of special team support. Now, number 12 in terms of special team support among the GOAT group, Bart Starr. So Bart Starr, overall across his career, we've got 4% better than his opponents for special teams play. Categorically, field goal percentage was actually the worst category in terms of the special team support. Average throughout his career, the Packers were 7.72% worse than their opponents in terms of field goal percentage. That was due in large part to the last 3 years of his qualifying seasons being just atrocious. I mean, 31% worse, 53% worse, 19% worse. Up to that point, it had been kind of up and down and much closer to the average there. Yards per punt return delta, Bart Starr's special teams units played 11.57% better than their opponents throughout his career. And then yards per kick return delta, Starr's Packers played 8.41% better than his opponents throughout his career. Seasonally, he had a great special teams unit in 1967, resulting in a championship and Super Bowl. They were 63.76% better than their opponents that year in terms of special teams. So pretty impressive there. He had a few other elite seasons, and all said and told, a total of 5 elite special teams seasons. He had one great season of special teams play, one good season, one above average season, one average, one below average, one bad, and two atrocious special team seasons. So kind of all over the map there. But the highs were higher than the lows, and that brought his overall special team support to 4.09% better than his opponents throughout his career. And again, friendly reminder, there are visual aids available here at Pro Football Perspective on Instagram. That's at Pro Football Perspective. That way you can follow along. I am going through these a little more rapid fire style because, hey, I mean, typically the special teams plays are when we all get up to go to the bathroom or get a soda or whatever during the football game. So I'm trying to go through these a little bit more quickly as well, but I recognize that some of these numbers are jarring, and so take a look at Instagram at Pro Football Perspective to follow along there with the visual aid. Now, coming in at number 11 is John Elway. His special team support throughout his career was 3.83% better than his opponent, so above average there. The category that stood out as his worst throughout his career was the field goal percentage delta. So in that category, the Broncos were negative 1.81% worse than their opponents throughout Elway's career. In terms of yards per punt return delta, he actually had special teams play that was 7.56% better than his opponents throughout his career, and yards per kick return delta was 5.75% better than his opponents throughout his career. Really did not have an elite special teams unit until the mid to late 90s. 1995 had fantastic special teams play there. Overall score of 45% better than their opponents. 96 dipped back down to average, and then 97, the first Super Bowl win there for Elway was 18.73% better special teams play than his opponents, and then in his final season dipped back down to just above average at 2.56% better than his opponents. All said and told, though, yeah, came in at number 11. Special teams play 3.83% better than his opponents throughout his career, and that's good enough for number 11 on this list. Number 10 in terms of special teams support in our GOAT group here is Johnny U. So Johnny Unitas had a special team support all over the map. There was a stretch in the early part of his career where the Colts just could not buy a field goal compared to their opponents, just year after year of atrocious play. Overall, his score was 3.35%. That's better than his opponents, 3.35% better than his opponents in terms of special team support. Categorically, field goal percentage delta was his worst category. The Colts were 4.94% worse than his opponents throughout his career. I say the Colts because, again, these are qualifying seasons, so the San Diego years are not in here. The yards per punt return delta score of 18.13% for his career, that's their best category, so they were much better than their opponents there. And yards per kick return delta, they performed at a rate of 3% worse than their opponents throughout his career. 1961 was the worst special team season of Unitas' career here, 24% worse than their opponents that season. And then a couple of seasons later followed it up in 1966 with a 30-burger, 30% better than his opponents that season, elite special teams play. Hit and miss kind of throughout his career. He had one above average season, a couple of average seasons, couple of great seasons, 4 good seasons. He had one atrocious, one below average, and then he had the 3 above, or the 3 elite seasons of special teams play. Bottom line is he came out 3.35% better than his opponents for special teams play. That's number 10 in the GOAT group, and we're moving on to number 9 now. Roger Staubach comes in at number 9, and that's at 2% better than his opponents in terms of special team support throughout his career. So number 9 in our GOAT group of special team support. Categorically here, pretty vanilla, really. The field goal percentage delta for his career was 2.67% better than the opponents. Yards per punt return delta was 4.65% better than his opponents. And yards per kick return delta was negative 1.21% worse than his opponents. Again, that comes out to an average just slightly over 2% better than his opponents throughout his career. Had a couple of seasons where there was some high numbers or low numbers. 1976 really came out at an elite level with a 24.78% better than their opponents that year in terms of special teams play. Had a couple of other down years. 1974 and 1979 were both 9.49% worse and 8.19% worse than their opponents that season overall. But number 9 on this list, he's kind of right in the middle of the group here, 2% better than his opponents in terms of special teams play. That's Roger Staubach. So there you have it, the first 8 quarterbacks of the GOAT group in terms of special team support. We've got Otto Graham at number 16, Tom Brady at number 15, Terry Bradshaw at number 14, Sammy Baugh at number 13, Bart Starr at number 12, John Elway at number 11, Johnny Unitas at number 10, and Roger Staubach at number 9. Now again, that's simply taking their field goal percentage delta, yards per punt return delta, and yards per kick return delta and averaging those across their career. There is another way we can look at these. If you wanted to give more weight to the field goal percentage, you would just double that. And that way you've got field goal percentage carrying more weight in the evaluation. If we did go ahead and do it that way, we'd be looking at the list as follows so far. The same 8 are the first 8 of these 16 quarterbacks in terms of special team support. Just slightly different scores and a little different order in terms of how it's presented. But if you look at weighting the field goal percentage play of their special teams. You've got Otto Graham at number 16, Sammy Baugh at number 15, Tom Brady at number 14, Terry Bradshaw at number 13, John Elway at number 12, Roger Staubach at number 11, Johnny Unitas at number 10, and Bart Starr at number 9. So again, just a shuffling of a few names there in terms of the order, but you can still see plainly that those 8 had the best special team support out of these 16 quarterbacks within the GOAT group. Thanks again for joining Pro Football Perspective. On the next episode, we'll conclude our special team support evaluation of the GOAT group, so look for that coming soon. Again, Pro Football Perspective is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, and be sure to follow along on Instagram at Pro Football Perspective. I'm Nathaniel Bradley. Deuces.